mantra, it means that is whole, this is whole. From the whole becomes whole, and if you take a piece away, what is left is still whole. Now, I love when a mantra or a spiritual text helps me to move deeper into wonder and curiosity and questioning, rather than my normal day-to-day self, which is the self that wants to know the right answer and have it be black or white, and okay, that is settled, I really know. But instead, this mantra helps us to open our curiosity and wonder, and not and it doesn't let us sort of settle on just the right answer, which I think is so important here. I was thinking about the way that this could connect even to the physical body, right? Just as each person and each sentient being on the planet has its own personality and its own place in the world and its own dharma and its own path, and yet we're all part of the same organism. And I was sort of in asana practice, and I was thinking, like, well, yeah, like, I call this my hand, but is there an exact point where I can say the hand ends and the wrist begins, and then is there an exact point where the wrist ends and the forearm begins? Is there an exact point where the elbow starts? And that even though we have names for separate parts, areas of the body, that really it's a full system, it's a full organism, right? And it becomes nearly impossible to just say one part of the body and completely separate and uninfluenced by every other part of the body, right? And same, so when we think about the goal of yoga being realizing the oneness of all beings, right? The oneness of all beings doesn't mean we're all exactly the same. It means we are all so very multifaceted and different, and we live in this sort of kaleidoscope of differences. And that whole wonderful, sparkling, shining, multifaceted web of differences is what makes life and living so beautiful and rich. And it is in fact what enables our interconnection, right? So to think about interconnectedness as like we all have our different part to play in supporting each other and in turn being supported. Also, I was reminded of this story by Buddhist teacher Jack Kornfield in his book, Bringing Home the Dharma. He talks about how occasionally difficulties and conflict arise even within his teaching community, even within his Dharma centers. And he says, a Dharma conflict was most strongly represented by a certain polarity between two teachers, one of whom was devoted to the very strict traditional style of meditation and taught in a very systematic and conservative manner according to the lineage tradition, according to the Burmese teachers. And the other teacher, although equally devoted to the Buddhist text, was much more formless and free, and was kind of expressing a Krishnamurti-like questioning spirit of teachers. He valued the radical side of the Buddha's teachings of liberation, to sort of throw out the bondage of tradition and live in the reality of now. That was the sort of radical teacher's ethos, right? And so Jack Kornfield says, as I look back, I now find these difficulties somewhat amusing, although it was also very painful and still can be. Nevertheless, I think conflict is part of human experience, and I'm interested in how conflict is incorporated into practice rather than simply avoiding it. So there were conservative voices that wanted to keep things exactly the way they were, and there were sort of radical voices who said we're in a new culture and we have to adapt and we have to be free. At one point, so they had a teacher meeting, and at one point, the person leading the meeting says, "I'd like to ask the most polarized voices to leave the room. Go out and we'll call you back later." So first, the most radical teacher who wanted adaptation and change and updates was asked to leave the room. And then the leader said to the group, "Suppose this teacher was banished from the community so that you would never have to bother us anymore. How would that affect you all?" And so we've sat in a circle and we've reflected on it. And at first we recognized that without the conflict, our lives would be easier and more relaxed. But then something else became quite clear. If his voice wasn't here, the need for immediate liberation and that this voice proclaims would be so necessary, and it would have to be taken up by the rest of us. In other words, the rest of us would have to fill this urgency for liberation, this radical voice, to kind of in our own ways. And then the leader invited the teacher back into the room and sent the most conservative teacher out of the room. And he said, "Now suppose this teacher, who's concerned with conserving tradition and practicing the forms quite strictly, was no longer part of the community. How would that affect you all?" And at first, again, we could feel the relaxing of tension that came from holding tightly to this conservative perspective. But then several of us said, if this teacher were not teaching the traditional perspective that he does, we would all have to do more, because it's so much more important that people receive this perspective. He is carrying the conservative teachings for the whole community, and that frees us to be more creative, right? So it's kind of interesting. I resonated with this story so much. I think because I sort of see myself as being more conservatively Jivamukti. Like, I strive to really teach the way that Sharon and David taught, and I sort of I want to keep things. I want to keep the tradition intact and together. And then, as you know, not only in Jivamukti, but in other kinds of yoga practice, yoga has become so multifaceted, so creative. It's gone in so many different directions. Sometimes that makes me anxious. I want to resist that by keeping the tradition as steady as I can. But this story really resonated with me, because I thought, oh yeah, actually there is room for voices like mine that want to conserve things, and voices that are a bit more on the creative side, and both have value. All of our voices have value within that community, even though it feels like a tension. And I just thought that was so beautiful. I hope you resonate with it too. Which one are you? Do you fall more on the sort of radical creative side? Do you fall a little bit more on the traditional side? Where do you fall in that perspective? And what did that story make you think of with regards to your teaching practice, or even your yoga practice, right? This tune is a little bit more intermediate-ish, so good luck. Practice more and more.